Ever wondered how a single company could become as powerful as a nation, waging wars, minting its own money, and building an empire? Today, we're diving into the incredible story of the Vereenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or VOC, better known as the Dutch East India Company. This wasn't just any business. It was the world's first multinational corporation, and its legacy shaped the modern world in ways you might not expect. So, how did this corporate titan come to be? Picture this. It's the late 1500s. Spices like nutmeg, cloves, and pepper are the hottest commodities in Europe, worth more than their weight in gold. The Portuguese have a stranglehold on this lucrative trade, and the Dutch want in. Ambitious Dutch merchants started sending their own ships to the East Indies. But there was a problem. They were all competing against each other. This fierce internal rivalry drove down prices and profits. The Dutch government, the States General, saw this chaos and had a brilliant, if ruthless, idea. On March 20th, 1602, they forced all these competing trading companies to merge into one single, unified entity, the VOC. This wasn't just about making money. It was a strategic move to create a commercial juggernaut that could challenge the mighty Portuguese and Spanish empires on the high seas. What made the VOC truly revolutionary was the charter it received from the government. This document gave the company powers that are almost unbelievable today. It was granted a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. But that was just the beginning. The VOC was authorized to build forts, maintain its own army and navy, negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, and even declare war. It could administer justice, establish colonies, and execute criminals. In essence, the Dutch government outsourced its foreign policy and military expansion to a private company. The VOC was a state within a state. To manage this massive enterprise, the company was structured in a uniquely Dutch way. It was divided into 6 chambers, located in major port cities like Amsterdam and Middelburg. Each chamber managed its own affairs, but answered to a central board of directors known as the Heren 17, or the Gentleman 17. This board, with representatives from each chamber, made the big strategic decisions, like where to send fleets and how to distribute profits. Amsterdam, being the wealthiest city, held the most power, with 8 of the 17 seats. This structured balanced local interests with the company's overall goals, a complex system of checks and balances that was far ahead of its time. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the VOC truly changed the game. To fund its incredibly expensive voyages, the company needed a massive amount of capital. So, it did something that had never been done on this scale before. It held an initial public offering. The VOC raised an astonishing 6.5 million guilders, a fortune at the time. What's more, anyone could buy in. Shares weren't just for the super-rich. Ordinary citizens, from merchants to maids, invested their savings, becoming part owners of this global enterprise. This created the world's first true stock market. For the first time, you could buy and sell shares in a company on a secondary market. If you needed your money back, you didn't have to wait for a ship to return from a 2-year voyage. You could simply sell your share to another investor. This concept of liquid, tradable shares was a financial revolution, and the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, where VOC shares were traded, became the model for every stock exchange that followed. The company's primary mission was simple: control the spice trade. The potential profits were astronomical. A pound of nutmeg bought 4 pennies in the Banda Islands. The so-called Spice Islands could be sold for a fortune back in Amsterdam. The VOC's goal was to cut out the middlemen, sail directly to the source, and secure a monopoly by any means necessary. The first fleets were sent to scout the region, establish trading posts, and build relationships with local rulers. In 1619, a pivotal decision was made. Under the leadership of the formidable Governor-General Jan Pieter Schoenkoyn, the company conquered the port of Jayakarta on the island of Java. They burned it to the ground and built a new city in its place, Batavia, which we know today as Jakarta. Batavia became the administrative heart of the VOC's Asian empire. It was a fortified city, a bustling port, and the command center from which the company managed its vast network of trade routes. From its headquarters in Batavia, the VOC projected its power across the Indian Ocean, from modern-day South Africa to Japan, and from India all the way to the shores of Australia. But this expansion didn't happen in a vacuum. The world the VOC entered was crowded and hostile. The Portuguese, who had a century's head start, were not about to give up their empire without a fight. The Spanish, their powerful allies, joined the resistance, and a new rival, the English East India Company, was also vying for a piece of the pie. On top of that, local sultans and established Asian trading networks were wary of these aggressive newcomers from Europe. The VOC's response was a pragmatic mix of diplomacy and brute force. They would negotiate when they could and fight when they felt they had to. Early naval battles against the Portuguese proved that in this era, trade and warfare were two sides of the same coin. To succeed, the VOC had to be not just a company of merchants, but also a company of soldiers and sailors. Despite its immense power, the VOC was not without its own internal struggles. The company did have accountability mechanisms that were quite advanced. Shareholders received financial reports, and the board of directors had to justify their decisions. The chamber system fostered a degree of internal competition that, in theory, kept everyone on their toes. However, the system was far from perfect. There were constant disagreements between the chambers over strategy. More importantly, terrain was the tyranny of distance. A message sent from Amsterdam to Batavia could take 6 months or more to arrive. By the time orders from the Gentleman 17 reached the Governor-General in Asia, the situation on the ground could have completely changed. This often led to governors like Cohen taking matters into their own hands, pursuing aggressive policies that sometimes went directly against the wishes of the board back home. The story of the VOC's rise is a tale of innovation, ambition, and ruthlessness. It pioneered corporate structures and financial markets that we still use today, while simultaneously building a colonial empire through military force. It was a company that blurred the lines between commerce and conquest, forever changing the course of global history. Ever wondered how a single company could dominate half the world's trade, build a private army bigger than many nations, and rule over vast territories for 2 centuries? It sounds like something out of a blockbuster movie, but this was the reality of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC. This wasn't just a business. It was a global power, an empire in its own right. Let's start with the most visible part of the VOC's power: its military. This was no mere security force. At its peak, the company had around 25,000 soldiers and sailors stationed across Asia. Imagine that, a corporation with its own army and navy. Their fleet was enormous, with over 150 ships, and these weren't just cargo haulers. They were armed to the teeth, essentially floating fortresses capable of taking on enemy warships and blasting coastal defenses to rubble. Alongside these giants, they operated a whole swarm of smaller ships for zipping between Asian ports. This military muscle wasn't just for show. It allowed the VOC to fight wars against European rivals like the Portuguese and the English, to strong-arm Asian rulers into signing deals, and to brutally crush anyone who dared to resist their authority. When it came to business, the VOC's favorite word was monopoly, and they pursued it with chilling efficiency. Take the story of the Banda Islands, the world's only source of nutmeg and mace at the time. In 1621, the Governor-General, a man named Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, decided he wanted total control. His solution was horrifying. The native population of about 15,000 people was almost completely wiped out, killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. Cohen then had all the nutmeg trees on islands not under his direct control destroyed. He replaced the original inhabitants with Dutch colonists and enslaved laborers, ensuring every single nutmeg sold in the world had to pass through VOC hands. A similar, though slightly less extreme, playbook was used for cloves in the Malay. They'd signed treaties with local sultans, forcing them to sell exclusively to the VOC. To enforce these deals, they built forts, patrolled the seas, and sent out expeditions called Hongi raids to destroy any clove trees growing in unauthorized areas. It was a methodical and brutal way to corner a market. To manage this sprawling empire, the VOC built an impressive administrative machine. The nerve center was the city of Batavia, known today as Jakarta. From there, a powerful governor-general oversaw everything happening in Asia. Reporting to him was a whole hierarchy of governors, directors, and managers running regional operations. They had major hubs everywhere: Ceylon for cinnamon, Bengal for textiles, Malacca to control the vital shipping strait, and even a post in Japan, where for a time they were the only Europeans allowed to trade. Each of these posts was a miniature bureaucracy, keeping meticulous records of every transaction, every bit of inventory, and all the local political gossip. These detailed reports were sent back to Batavia and eventually all the way to the company directors in Amsterdam. This system gave the bosses in Europe a degree of oversight, but the huge time lag in communication meant that the officials in Asia had a massive amount of freedom to act on their own, for better or very often for worse. What's really fascinating is that the VOC wasn't just shipping Asian goods back to Europe. They became a major player within Asia itself. They figured out that they could make a fortune just by moving goods between different Asian countries. This is called inter-Asian trade. For example, they'd take silver from Japan and trade it for silk and gold in China. Then they'd take textiles from India and sell them in the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. Often, these regional trade routes were even more profitable than the long-haul voyages to Europe. This strategy was brilliant because it helped pay for the company SMSE military and administrative costs right there in Asia. They wove themselves into the fabric of existing trade networks, often kicking out or replacing local merchants. The VOC essentially became an Asian trading power in its own right, creating economic dependencies that made them indispensable to many local rulers, which further strengthened their grip. Diplomacy was another key tool in the VOC's arsenal. They were masters of playing the long game. The company negotiated treaties with dozens of Asian powers, from the mighty Mughal Emperor in India to small-time sultans in Indonesia and the reclusive Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. These weren't one-size-fits-all agreements. They were tailored to each situation, but the goal was always the same: secure trading privileges, get tax exemptions, and gain permission to build fortified trading posts. They often pitched themselves as allies. For instance, in Sri Lanka, they helped the local kingdom of Kandy fight off the Portuguese, only to take over the coastal territories for themselves later on. In Indonesia, they would back one sultanate against another, and in the chaos, they would expand their own control piece by piece. To do this effectively, they invested in understanding local politics and culture. They employed translators, learned the local customs, and knew exactly how to present themselves in different royal courts. It was a sophisticated game of chess played on a continental scale. Of course, running this empire required a massive amount of labor, and the VOC's methods were anything but gentle. Coercion was the name of the game. They tapped into and expanded existing systems of slavery, buying tens of thousands of people from markets in India, Indonesia, Madagascar, and Africa. These enslaved individuals were forced to work on plantations, build fortifications, and serve as domestic labor. Alongside enslaved people, the company hired wage workers, but the conditions were appalling. Sailors and soldiers signed up for fixed terms, but the pay was often late. The work was dangerous, and tropical diseases were rampant. The death rate on the long sea voyage from Europe to Asia was staggering, around 15% on average, and could be much higher during outbreaks. Many who signed on with the VOC never saw their homes again, dying from disease, in battle, or from accidents in a faraway land. Desertion was a constant problem, a testament to the brutal reality of working for the company. To keep everyone in line, the VOC had its own legal system. In the territories they controlled, company officials acted as judges, handling both criminal and civil cases. They dealt with everyone: company employees, Dutch colonists, and the local populations. The laws were based on Dutch law but twisted for colonial purposes, and the punishments were harsh. Serious crimes like murder, mutiny, or major theft could get you the death penalty. Discipline for their own soldiers and sailors was especially strict, with military law giving officers huge power to punish anyone under their command. This judicial power also meant the VOC could meddle in local disputes. While they sometimes allowed local customs to handle cases between local people, the company's interests always came first. They effectively inserted themselves into the structure of local governance, reinforcing their authority from the top down. Ultimately, the entire VOC enterprise was designed for one thing: economic extraction. The most obvious source of profit was, of course, trade. They bought spices and other luxury goods at low prices, often in markets where they had a total monopoly, shipped them to Europe, and sold them for a massive markup. The profits were then distributed to their shareholders. But that was just one piece of the puzzle. In the territories they directly controlled, The VOC collected taxes. They charged duties on ships entering their ports, taxed agricultural production, and levied fees on anyone who wanted a piece of their monopolies. They also ran their own plantations, growing cash crops like sugar and coffee using forced labor. They even made money by renting out space on their ships to other merchants. The cumulative effect was a massive transfer of wealth from Asia to Europe, on a scale that the world had never seen before. The VOC wasn't just a company. It was a highly efficient, militarized, and ruthless machine for generating profit, and it reshaped the global economy in its image. Its legacy is complex and often dark, but its story is a powerful reminder of how commerce and power can intertwine to change the course of history. Imagine a company so powerful, its value dwarfed that of Apple, Google, and Amazon combined. This wasn't a tech giant from Silicon Valley, but a 17th century trading corporation that ruled the seas and shaped the modern world. To dominate the lucrative spice trade, a market then controlled by the Portuguese, and dominated did. By the mid-1600s, the VOC had effectively booted Portugal out of the East Indies and sidelined its English rivals, establishing a near-total monopoly over spices like nutmeg, mace, and cloves commodities, ones worth their weight in gold. The sheer scale of its operations is mind-boggling. Between its founding and its dissolution in 1796, the VOC dispatched nearly 5,000 ships to Asia. That's more than all other European trading companies put together. These ships carried over 1 million Europeans to the east, though the perilous journey meant many never saw home again. The cargo they brought back wasn't just spices. Soon, the holds were filled with fine Indian textiles, delicate Chinese porcelain, and the newly fashionable drinks of tea and coffee. For its first century, the profits just kept rolling in. So, how much was the VOC actually worth? Historians have tried to calculate its value in today's money, and the estimates are staggering, somewhere between $7 and $8 trillion. While these are just approximations, they consistently crown the VOC as the wealthiest corporation ever. Back then, of course, they didn't have stock tickers, but the company's shares were traded vigorously on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. At its peak, a single share could sell for 4 or 5 times its original price, a testament to the incredible investor confidence in the company's future. Shareholders were rewarded handsomely, with average annual returns exceeding 20% in the early decades. Sometimes they were paid in cash, other times in precious spices they could sell themselves. But the VOC's legacy isn't just about wealth. It's about how it revolutionized finance. It pioneered concepts that are the bedrock of modern capitalism. Before the VOC ventures were typically short-term. A ship went on a voyage, came back, and the profits were divided. The VOC changed the game. It introduced the idea of permanent capital. Investors bought into the company, not just a single trip. This gave the VOC stability and the ability to plan for the long term. If an investor wanted out, they didn't pull their money from the company. They simply sold their shares to someone else. This created the world's first real secondary stock market. And with a stock market came all the things we see today: speculation, price discovery, and even financial manipulation. Clever investors started short selling, betting that the company's share price would fall. They invented options, contracts to speculate on future prices. Naturally, this led to the first attempts at financial regulation to tackle fraud and insider trading. All these financial innovations happened in Amsterdam decades, even centuries, before they took hold in London or New York. Managing a global empire required sophisticated accounting. The VOC had to track thousands of employees, hundreds of ships, and vast quantities of goods spread across continents. They developed advanced methods for consolidating accounts from their various chambers, managing cash flow across years-long voyages, and even estimating the value of cargo still at sea. They calculated the depreciation of their assets, like ships and buildings, though they were sometimes a bit optimistic about how long things would last. They also had auditors to prevent fraud, but with operations so far from home, it was a constant battle. Many a company official in Asia got rich through private-side deals, diverting profits that should have gone to the company. The VOC's reach was truly global. Its network of trading posts, or factories, dotted the coastlines of Asia. In India, they set up shop in places like Surat and the Coromandel Coast, primarily trading in cotton textiles, which were in high demand across Asia. The heart of their empire was Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, in Indonesia. From this fortified headquarters, they controlled a web of outposts from Malacca to the Spice Islands and beyond. They were the only Europeans allowed to trade with isolationist Japan, operating from the tiny man-made island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. For a time, they held Taiwan and traded in Chinese ports whenever they could. Their influence stretched to Persia and Arabia, and on the long voyage out, they established a crucial refreshment station at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652, which would eventually grow into the colony of South Africa. While spices were the initial prize, the VOC quickly diversified. Indian textiles became a cornerstone of their trade, both for markets in Europe and for bartering within Asia. As European tastes changed, Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea became massive revenue generators. They traded Japanese copper throughout the region and turned coffee, first from Yemen and then from plantations they established in Java, into a global commodity. The company wasn't just a trader. It was an agent of biological exchange, moving crops, like coffee and tea, to new regions, forever changing global agriculture. They moved from simply buying goods to controlling production directly, often through plantations that relied on various forms of forced labor. To support this sprawling enterprise, the VOC invested heavily in infrastructure. Batavia became a major city, with massive warehouses, shipyards, administrative offices, and fortifications. They built forts at strategic points across their territories, operated their own shipyards to build and repair their vast fleet, and even ran hospitals for their employees, though with the medical knowledge of the time. Mortality rates remained tragically high. They built churches and employed ministers, partly for the European staff and partly for missionary work among local populations. Roads, canals, and bridges were constructed, creating infrastructure that, while built for profit, would shape the development of these regions for centuries to come. Operating in such a dangerous world required a masterful approach to risk management. The loss of a ship to a storm or pirates was a common occurrence. The VOC survived by spreading its risk. By having hundreds of ships on dozens of voyages at any given time, the loss of one or two was a setback, not a catastrophe. A sophisticated insurance market also emerged to help distribute this risk. The company kept large cash reserves to absorb losses, and even smoothed its earnings reports to keep its share price stable. Its geographic diversity was another key strength. A war in India wouldn't necessarily sink profits from the spice trade in Indonesia. Their monopoly power protected them from competition, but they still faced the constant threats of war, piracy, and natural disasters. Even its internal structure, with multiple chambers in different Dutch cities, created a level of redundancy that made the entire organization incredibly resilient. The Dutch East India Company was more than just a company. It was a pioneering, innovative, and ruthless force that created the first global supply chains, invented key aspects of modern finance, and connected the world in ways never seen before. Its story is a complex tapestry of commerce, conflict, innovation, and exploitation, a story that laid the foundations for the globalized world we live in today. Ever wondered how a company that once controlled half of Europe's trade, commanded a private army of 10,000 soldiers, and had its own fleet of warships could just disappear? The story of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, isn't just a business case study, it's an epic tale of ambition, greed, and inevitable decay. For nearly 200 years, it was the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. But its downfall wasn't a sudden crash. It was a slow, agonizing bleed-out that lasted for a century. So, how did this corporate titan fall from grace? Let's dive into the spectacular collapse of the VOC. The rot started from within. Imagine a company where everyone, from the top executives to the clerks on the ground, is stealing from the till. That was the VOC. In the 18th century, officially, company officials were forbidden from private trading, but in reality, it was rampant. They used company ships and resources to run their own side hustles, buying and selling goods for personal profit. This wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a systemic plague. Even the governors general, the highest-ranking officials in Asia, were some of the worst offenders, amassing huge fortunes, while the company's profits dwindled. Back in Amsterdam, the board of directors, the famous Heren 17, were flying blind. The reports they received from Asia were masterpieces of creative accounting, designed to hide the corruption and paint a rosy picture. Communication was slow, taking months for a letter to travel from Batavia to Amsterdam, making any real oversight nearly impossible. And even if they wanted to crack down, who would enforce the rules? The very people in charge of enforcement were often the ones benefiting most from breaking them. It was a classic case of the foxes guarding the henhouse. While the company was being eaten alive from the inside, it was also bleeding out on the battlefield. The VOC wasn't just a trading company. It was a quasi-state, and maintaining its empire was expensive. Throughout the 18th century, it was dragged into one costly war after another. They fought local rulers who resisted their expansion, clashed with European rivals, and spent fortunes maintaining forts, garrisons, and fleets across a vast territory. The money that should have been profit was instead being spent on cannons and soldiers. The final military nail in the coffin was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, from 1780 to 1784. The British Royal Navy was a formidable foe. They decimated the VOC's fleet, captured its ships, and seized crucial trading posts in India and Ceylon. The company's naval power was shattered, and it never recovered. The war pushed the company's finances past the breaking point, leading to a mountain of debt it could no longer manage through trade revenue alone. And then there was the competition. The world was changing, but the VOC wasn't. The English East India Company, once a rival, was now a powerhouse. With its growing control over India, Britain had access to vast markets and goods that the VOC couldn't match. The English company was more dynamic, more aggressive, and ultimately, more successful. The French were also in the game, further squeezing the VOC's influence. The very idea of a government-granted monopoly, the cornerstone of the VOC's power, was becoming obsolete. Smugglers and independent country traders chipped away at their official trade, while economists and philosophers began arguing for free trade. The VOC's monopoly, once its greatest strength, was now seen as an inefficient relic of a bygone era, holding back commerce rather than promoting it. Back home in the Netherlands, political turmoil added to the chaos. The country was divided, with factions fighting for control. When the French Revolution spilled over the border and the Batavian Republic was established in 1795, the VOC lost its powerful political protectors. The new revolutionary government was ideologically opposed to old-world institutions like chartered monopolies. The company's political lifeline had been cut. By the 1780s, the financial disaster could no longer be hidden. The company stopped paying dividends to its shareholders. It was borrowing massive amounts of money just to stay afloat. The debt ballooned to over 100 million guilders, an astronomical sum that dwarfed its assets. The share price, once the pride of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, collapsed, wiping out investors who had paid a fortune for a piece of the company. The once mighty Volks was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. Ironically, the very territories the VOC had fought so hard to conquer became a huge liability. The cost of administering places like Java far exceeded any commercial benefit they provided. Constant local resistance required expensive military campaigns to suppress. The brutal plantation systems, which relied on forced labor, only fueled more opposition. The company, once a trading partner, was now a hated colonial master, and it simply lacked the money and manpower to effectively govern its sprawling, resentful empire. At its core, the VOC failed to adapt. The world had moved on, but the company hadn't. Its primary trade, spices, which had been worth their weight in gold in the 17th century, became less valuable as supply increased and European tastes shifted to things like coffee, tea, and sugar. But competition in these new commodities was fierce, and profit margins were slim. The VOC's rigid, bureaucratic structure resisted any meaningful change. Management was conservative, focused on preserving the old ways rather than innovating. It was a dinosaur, unable to compete with the nimbler, more modern trading enterprises that were emerging. The end finally came on December 31st, 1799. The Dutch government, now the Batavian Republic, officially dissolved the VOC. It absorbed all of the company's assets, its territories, and, most importantly, its colossal debt. After 197 years, the world's first multinational corporation was no more. The company's trading posts and territories in Asia became the official colonial possessions of the Netherlands, giving birth to the Dutch East Indies. In many ways, it was just a change of management. The same people often kept their jobs, simply swapping a company uniform for a government one. But the legacy of the VOC is far more complex than just a failed business. It created the blueprint for the modern publicly traded corporation, with shares, permanent capital, and a stock exchange. The financial world we live in today has deep roots in the system the VOC pioneered. However, there is a much darker side to its legacy. The VOC set the precedent for corporate colonialism, the ruthless extraction of resources, and the blurring of lines between commerce and conquest. Its methods of monopolization, forced labor, and military violence created a pattern that other colonial powers would follow. The Dutch colonial state that inherited its territories continued many of these exploited policies for another 150 years. The economic and social scars left by the VOC's two-century reign in Asia are still visible today, a lasting reminder of the human cost of its incredible wealth and power. The story of the VOC's decline is a powerful lesson. No empire, whether political or corporate, is too big to fail, especially when it refuses to change with the world around it. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into history interesting, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more stories about the rise and fall of giants. See you next time.